let's move to another speaker, David Schildknecht. Please welcome to the stage. If you don't know David, David is actually a legend. He covered Burgundy and Germany for Robert Parker because Robert didn't have a clue about how to judge Burgundy, so David took it over, and that's it. David, please welcome.
I was getting some booming from those mics. Can everybody hear me fine?
Yeah.
No problem? Okay. I just have to leave my cheat sheet here for a couple of quotes. Yeah, so I wanted to address the issue of style, but I'm going to start with a bit of history. Some of you may be bored, but I find the references to, historical references to Blaufränkisch seem to be... For the online. Oh.
Yeah, it's...
Yeah, okay. Is that a good level?
Solid.
It's good?
Yeah, a bit more maybe, yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
all right.
Good.
And so I find the references, the historical references, are sometimes very incomplete and muddled, and I like to believe that history is very important, and for nothing else, in the case of wine, as a clue to possible... Yeah, that's why I asked you. Yeah. All right, are we now ready?
Absolutely.
You have to tell me, okay. All right, so, you know, history is interesting, perhaps partly as a clue to style. In fact, an opportunity to give another plug for Simon's book about skin macerated wines. If you want to see how history is relevant to style, why, if you haven't read Amber Revolution, you'll get a great lesson in that connection. So the history of Blaufränkisch is very hard to pull out, and the principal reason for that you can find right at the beginning of the very short commentary that was written about an imperial wine exposition in 1862, and which is usually cited as the first reference to Blaufränkisch as a grape. I think I can remember this one by heart. The entry begins, Blaufränkisch, frequently misrepresented in this exposition as red Burgundy, and known as Lemberger in Germany. That's how it begins. Well, a couple of things we can see already. Although this seems to be the earliest reference to Blaufränkisch by name that we can find, or at least that Google Books can dig up, it's pretty obvious just from the introduction that it's not a grape variety that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. In fact, the author pointing out that the wine was being presented at the exposition, just identified as Burgundy. And in fact, if you go back to the earliest references, for instance, in former German West Hungary, the Esterházes had some plantings already at the end of the 18th century that went under the name Red Burgundy, some grapes that apparently they put great stock in, and that could be, that was in Horizon, by the way, that could be the origination of Blaufränkisch planting in German West Hungary. We just don't know. If we look at the situation in Württemberg, where's the only significant plantings of Lemberger or Limberger, as it was then known, you'd only see references really beginning in the second or third decade of the 19th century. I met Daniel Deckers very briefly at the Vinery, and he told me that he was thrilled to have come up with two early lists from the 1820s from Germany of pépinierists who were selling Lemberger vines. But you know, I'm going to concentrate mostly on Austria, which I know best, but it is kind of interesting to note that up until the end of the 1980s, the total acreage of Blaufränkisch in Germany was considerably less than the acreage of Blaufränkisch in Slovenia today. It then exploded, and now there are 4.5 times as much acreage. but it always took second place to other grape varieties and was usually blended out and really emerged only as a significant solo cepage in the 1990s. So in a way, the evolution in Germany is not so different from what I'm going to tell you about a bit in Austria. Anyway, back to that earliest references. 1862 is really very misleading because Shams, the Hungarian, whose books on the then empire are considered the first really comprehensive accounts of viticulture in what is today Hungary, Slovenia, Austria, etc. He already mentions Schildknecht in his book in 1835. What's really amazing to me still about the history there is that this is not a reference in his 1832 tome about grape growing in Hungary. This is in his 1835 book about grape growing in Austria, because the first mention of the grape as Schildknecht is in the Baden sector of what's today the Thermenregion, so in then Austria, and it is as an appearance. I love he says as erleuchtet. It's beginning to emerge into view in this area as a grape to blend with the traditional Pinot Noir, or Burgunder, if you will, and Portugieser. So we can see that the earliest distinctive reference to the significance of and importance of Blaufränkisch is as a blending grape. It added something to the mix, and because the Pinot Noir was already really well established, possibly since medieval times in that area south of Vienna, why they made a sharp distinction between what was a Burgundy from Burgundian origins and this interloper Blaufränkisch. Later commentators often refer to the two Burgundies, Portugieser and the two Burgundies. Why nobody in today's Thermenregion would not be at least interested in creating such a blend, I don't know, but it hasn't happened since. Almost all the references then that we see in the latter part of the 19th century are still references to the use of Blaufränkisch for blending in the wines in the Baden area. Now, so the 1862. Pull it up for the original. The 1862 reference. Oh, it always gets cited, but nobody ever reads the entire reference. So, to go back to the beginning again, wrongly known under the name of Burgundy, widely shown and wrongly presented as Burgundy in this exposition, known as Lemberger on the Rhine. It's a grape variety which, on account of its late ripening, high acid, low coloring, modest productivity, on account of that, it's only capable of making the least sort of red wine. Weit geringer in Rotwein, a much lesser red wine than those of the preceding varieties. And guess what the preceding varieties on his list were? Of course, Portugieser and Pinot Noir. And can, on that account, absolutely not be recommended for planting. So the reference was, please stay away from this grape. Now, if we want to fast forward to what we know a little bit more about, the evolution of Blaufränkisch style in Austria, at least, in present-day Austria in the 20th century, you can see that the 1862 description kind of nailed the issues that were involved there. And the consumption of the style and consumption of Blaufränkisch, as far as we can tell, for most of the 20th century, was a fairly early drinking, light, fresh wine. It seems to have had something of the negative reputation that all those horrible wines of the Wachau had during the 19th century, too sour, too high acidity. And so one way to look at what has happened in the evolution now in the later 20th century evolution of Blaufränkisch, one way to look at it is people trying to run away from the grape or trying to figure out how to compensate for its limitations. And possibly we can also see people trying to embrace the characteristics that in an earlier period in history seemed like detriments or disadvantages to the grape. It's a little bit difficult when you talk to the old timers. It's a little bit difficult to get eyewitness accounts of what Blaufränkisch during, let's say, the 60s and 70s in present-day Burgenland tasted like. But what we do know for sure is that the acidity was suddenly emerged as a potentially positive factor because, as the old-timers will tell you, when Austria was trying to revive their viticulture in the 70s, 60s, 70s, they were very much looking toward Germany for advice. It was German tourists who were starting to come in numbers and bring some money into the country to buy wine, and the emphasis was on producing fresh, bright, high-acid whites. As a result, the interpretation of Blaufränkisch was that if you left your Blaufränkisch in barrel for more than 3 or 4 months, for one thing, it would probably, horror of horrors, undergo malolactic fermentation, and secondly, you wouldn't be able to get it on the market fast enough to sell it as a fresh, lively wine. And so there was definitely a tendency toward superficiality in Blaufränkisch, and the turning point, really, by all accounts, came with Ernst Triebaumer when he got serious about the idea of giving this wine a bit of time in barrel, letting it go through malo. He said, that was never considered an issue until the Germans got involved in advising us, right? And then he made this wine from his Marienthal vineyard in 1986 that sort of by accident got placed in a prominent tasting, blind tasting with a lot of well-known red wines and well-respected red wines at the time, and it blew everybody away. And subsequent tastings confirmed that this was a wine of extraordinary quality. And in fact, it was. I'm delighted to say one reason I'm inspired by Blaufränkisch is it was only the second Blaufränkisch that I ever tasted, because I was tasting it with Triebaumer, and then after tasting me on an earlier Blaufränkisch, then he popped this wine on me. At the time, it was already 9 years in the bottle when I first tasted it. And in any case, that was really an epiphanal moment in the stylistic history of Blaufränkisch. But the role of genetics was really decisive already at that stage, and too little recognized, because what's growing there in the Marienthal is a quite distinctive population of Blaufränkisch with relatively small berries, loose clusters, and after 1986 is 1992. It took till 1992 before some of his colleagues got serious about trying to showcase Blaufränkisch as a wine. So that's the year when you have Umriss from Pfeiler Artinger, you have an Ungerberg Blaufränkisch from John Nidnaus, and the next year you have from the Priors the Goldberg Blaufränkisch. So all of a sudden the idea that you would have a serious Blaufränkisch and that it could be showcase a vineyard got going. Now, a couple of anecdotes about that era that I think are quite illuminating. First off, at the time, probably after Triebaumer, Kolvenz probably had the highest reputation in Austria for red wine, and this was largely with wines from Cabernet and Merlot. He was a pioneer in planting the Bordeaux varieties. And, I remember asking him, say, well, why were you later to the party on Blaufränkisch? Because he certainly had fantastic history. And, you know, he gave a very honest appraisal. He said, you know, I realized that the only way to get people's attention of red wine in Austria was to do something that would have a connection with the international market. And that if you could demonstrate with Cabernet and Merlot that you could produce something really outstanding, people would pay a lot more attention to you. It's amusing, though, to me that still, I mean, this is perhaps prejudicial, but I mean, if I have to drink Cabernet and Merlot from Austria, I would still definitely go to Tribaumer or to Kolbenz. I haven't really tasted very many exciting developments with Merlot or Cabernet since. It's sort of a bit of a dead end. And the John Nittenhouse's 92, Ungerberg, which I tasted in 1999, and it was fantastic wine, but it was actually, he viewed it as an experiment. And he actually made two single cepage, single vineyard reds that year. The other one was a pure Merlot. In the end, in the years immediately following, he followed up on the Merlot. He didn't follow up on the Blaufränkisch. It was a number of years before he got back to producing a Blaufränkisch. Again, you can see the tendency now to try to say, well, we better view Blaufränkisch under the aspect of Bordeaux, under that sort of international aspect. And the Goldberg from Prieler, despite the success that Tribaumer's wine had and the press that had gotten, Prieler couldn't sell the wine after they got it in the bottle. And in 1996, so by that time the wine had been almost 2 years in bottle, they had sold 24 bottles in total to their Austrian countrymen. And they just lucked out because a Swiss agent came by, tasted the wine, and said, oh my God, how much of this do you have? And it was gone. And eventually, of course, this has often been the case, eventually the Austrians learned what they had given up, and they were able to reclaim their share of the wine. Anyway, you can see that things were very tentative. The start at first was slow, and now to take that back to the issue of style and the tension between expressing Blaufränkisch's uniqueness and compensating for its perceived weaknesses. After this early flourishing in the early 1990s, Austria got increasingly serious about their red wine. Of course, it helped that they began to get international headlines for their Rieslings and Grüner Veltliner from the Wachau. They had people like Louis Kracher as ambassadors internationally. So red wine got pulled along. And in that period, you had a really strong tendency to try to say, okay, the grape is really high acid, so what can we do to compensate for that? Well, we have to leave it. We have to leave it on the vine longer. Perhaps there's a few tricks in the cellar that we need to engage in. Also, that the wine is very modest in tannin, and now if you're starting to perceive it up against Merlot, Cabernet, Syrah, you start to get worried about that. But no problem, because wood has lots of tannin too, and Così fan tutti, everybody's into barrique, so you put it in barrique. It's a little sweet sour. Well, you sweeten it a little more with a little more oak. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but essentially a strong trend developed for producing Blaufränkisch that could stand international comparison, and was perhaps as a result less distinctively Blaufränkisch. So when I got involved by the late 90s, I was tasting pretty regularly in Burgenland, and this was on the eve of what I'm going to suggest is the next stylistic landmark for Blaufränkisch. And I remember tasting a lot of these wines and thinking, and I had a lot of experience in Bordeaux, and I thought, well, if they think these are ever going to make it in a direct comparison there, I think that they're barking up the wrong tree. People would try to explain to me why they took the approach that they did. And then I had a funny experience, because there was a little publishing house in Germany that reprinted the Goethe and Goethe Atlas from the 1870s. That was the go-to atlas of valuable grape varieties, of the most valuable grape varieties in the then monarchy, and so I had gotten a copy of this, and of course this is the short version. They were all hand-colored, beautiful engravings that were hand-colored to reproduce the different grapes. So I flip it open to the page for Blaufränkisch. Can't wait to read what the background from Goethe is essentially very thin, because he admitted too that we don't really know. He didn't know where this grape came from. That's coming, of course, but nobody knew at the time. You know, Lemberger, okay, we know now, referring to Slovenia, but I don't think that was clear at the time. The grape was associated in general with German West Hungary and with parts of the Hungarian crown, but it wasn't really fixed in terms of its source. But anyway, so Goethe's description and what he had to say about Blaufränkisch was not terribly interested. And what was revelatory to me was to look at the plate, and it's like these small conical cone-like clusters of little berries, and you know, beautiful. So I thought, well, I got to pack Goethe and Goethe in my luggage, because I'm going to really give some of these growers a hard time. So I go back to some of the people who had tried to explain to me how, you know, it's a thin-skinned, big grape variety, and you have to look at a way to compensate for that. And so I said, well, look, somehow I brought the subject around to people who are doing Pinot Noir too, of course, to clonal selections of Pinot Noir and the virtues of Selection Massal. And so I said, look at this beautiful picture from 1877, I think it was. I forget which date's the atlas here. Look at this gorgeous picture. So, oh yeah, these are. What a beautiful epitome of Pinot Noir. Then I flip it over to the other side to the facing page, and they see this is Blaufränkisch, circa 1870, and so you can see right away from the morphology of the grape and the nature of the berries, it was a very different animal. And what then happened, beginning at the end of the 90s, in terms of the next major advance stylistically for Blaufränkisch, was really absolutely dependent in part, to a significant degree, on finding a better material, which meant going to old vines, which unfortunately continue to diminish in number despite all of the notoriety that Blaufränkisch has justifiably gotten in the last 40 years. But in any case, going to old vines, starting to make vine selections, and that has been really a key to the quality of what came. Okay, so then the next seminal year is really 1999. And then you have a young guy named Uwe Schiefer in Südburgenland and Kritzler in Südburgenland. You have them beginning to get serious about Blaufränkisch, and in particular Schiefer, with much more of an inspiration from Burgundy. And so a very different approach to vinification. Most of you are versed enough in the differences that I don't have to explain a lot. But gradually open top fermentation, some use of whole clusters, different sort of barrel regimen, and a very conspicuously different character. Then one of the two Felix brothers, Roland, decided to nail to stake his reputation on Blaufränkisch, and began the Moritz project in 2001. And there he was trying to take lessons both from Burgundy and also from the Rhone. From the Rhone, especially inspiration of Chave to create complexity by doing microvinifications of individual parcels, but then putting them together and having a flagship wine, village-designated flagship wine, of which he then notoriously had two, the Neckenmark and the Lutzmannsburg. So at that point, we begin to see a tendency toward less extraction, much less prominence of oak, and also toward embracing the potential positive aspects of the higher acidity in the grape. and picking for grapes that still have a certain crunch to them. Then Dorlia Mura comes along, 2006, and you know, at the time she told me, she said, well, I mean, she was now taking this in a way to an extreme, at least in description, said, you know, I think I really want to make a beautiful red white wine. So to try to realize that Blaufränkisch, in a sense, there are certain white wine virtues that this grape has, and to try to bring those out. Now, I think that it's important to put this a bit of evolution that I just sketched into perspective in a couple of ways. First off, if you look especially about what's happened now in the last 20, 25 years, there are more and more people working with this grape who are seriously concerned about and understand the significance of vine genetics and the importance of trying to capture old vine genetics and practice selection massale. Certainly there is tremendously more sensitivity to the way in which the fruit gets extracted, the playing with whole clusters and playing with shorter vatting times and general pressing, etc. Definitely there's a tendency toward bigger barrels, older barrels, more sophistication of barrels, and much less knee-jerk use of whatever the Bordelais and Burgundians are having. And then in terms of extending the élevage, certainly there's a lot more play involved now in terms of how long the wines are given in barrel. And so all of this is tremendously important, but the perspective is that none of these are trends that are peculiar to Blaufränkisch. These are all trends that are taking place internationally with red wine. The second correction or bit of perspective to bear in mind, I think, is that in Austria, there is still the style of wine that was developed in the 1990s, a more powerful wine with attempt to give much more extraction from the Blaufränkisch, with later harvest, with prominence of new wood. The people who are most successful with that style are still fantastically successful, and not just in Austria, in Germany as well. In Germany, of course, the overwhelmingly largest market for Austrian wine. So I like to think of the stylistic perspective here as part of a general trend. I kind of pompously once called this the end of wine history. By that I mean we are increasingly style conscious, and God knows fashion continues to be an important factor in wine. But if you look at the incredible diversity of Blaufränkisch that's out there, and especially look at what we've got in store for you tomorrow morning in the tasting, I mean, what we see now is a tremendous stylistic diversity, and probably going forward indefinitely. There's no longer the sense that there has to be you know, a Hegelian or Marxian interpretation of, you know, where are we headed, a teleological notion of the destiny of Blaufränkisch. And when I especially when I got involved writing full-time for Bob Parker for a while, you know, people were always coming up to me and I mean, sometimes asking impossible questions, and I would all the time get the question, so what should be the style, or what do you see as the style of Blaufränkisch? I mean, this immediately conjures up to me the idea that there's style police up there, or that there's a court of stylistic judgment. And I mean, unfortunately, I hate to say this about Austria, but you know, it's not just Austria, but in the case of Blaufränkisch, Austria is at fault that often there is, at the highest echelons of the people who want to promote the wine, the people who write the wine laws, there is this kind of notion. We have to fix what the style is. We have to decide what is the typical, what is the correct expression of Blaufränkisch. I mean, this is totally deadly. Fortunately, I think now we've passed a point where for the people who are serious about this grape, that will never be an issue. People will find their way to produce something distinctively delicious from this grape, and although we have less of the inspiration from history in the case of Blaufränkisch, because we just don't know, as I said, what was being done even 60, 70 years ago with this grape. But if you look at what's happened in the evolution of other grapes, I think, for instance, of Riesling in the Mosel, or Grüner Veltliner in Lower Austria, I mean, you see that they're part of a trend for people to look back and try to think, well, what would it be like if we turned back the clock? Well, if we try to produce wine the way it would have and could have been produced 60 or 70 years ago, or maybe even earlier. Again, this is all wonderful, and this is not for somebody to define how Blaufränkisch should take a U-turn and go back, or a grape variety should take a U-turn and go back to the way it was before. It's simply exploring the many different possibilities that are out there. And so I like to think that going forward, we're going to keep this multiplicity. And certainly with respect to the potential interference from the wine police or the wine authorities, if you look at what's happening worldwide, I mean, the people who go their own way, the worst thing that happens, and it's terrible, but I mean, the worst thing is that they have to sell all their wine under fantasy names because the law doesn't allow them to tell you where it came from or what it's made from. But people are demonstrating every day that it works. It works. You can sell them. So I think we're going to have a great future of diverse Blaufränkisch styles. I should have kept track of time. I don't want to run out over here. Well, if I can give you just maybe 3-4 more minutes. Although I think it's deadly to think about trying to narrow down a particular style is correct, I also all the time get asked about where people try to interpret and we've all had this happen, interpret our own preferences in terms of wine. So I just want to put the notion of stylistic preference in a little bit of context. Obviously, it's fashionable today everywhere in the world to talk about trying to get a wine that is distinctively reflective of place, that somehow reflects the microclimate and the soils, or at least the region in which it's produced. I think that's well and good, but I think wine growers, it's easy for them to get carried away and perhaps not be realistic about how little we know about just what it is in the soil, in the microclimate, that has influences on the way in which the grape taste. And it's very easy to convince yourself, I'm sure as a producer, certainly I know as a critic, it's easy to convince yourself that you're tasting terroir, quote unquote, when perhaps you really don't know what exactly it is behind the flavors of your wine. So I think that it would be better to just leave it at distinctive. That's first, rather than distinctively reflective of, then we start to get into an area between science and metaphysics that we really don't have a roadmap. So that's the first thing. The second thing is going back to what I perhaps, with some exaggeration, talked about as the potential approach of trying to compensate for perceived weaknesses of Blaufränkisch versus the approach of, as I like to put it, letting Blaufränkisch be Blaufränkisch. Again, we need to be cautious here because Dorley is going to be able to tell you about it. If you want to have an example of truly distinctive set of Blaufränkisch wines that surely don't seem as though they could be produced anywhere else except in this little section of dwindling Western Carpathian mountains. I think then she would be a prime example. But she'll tell you how much time it takes, how much tasting, and not just tasting in your own cellar, but tasting with people internationally and comparatively tasting, if you really want to try to pull out a style that will also reflect the place in which the grapes are grown, it's a very, very long and hard row. So don't short circuit it just by employing all the buzzwords of terroir. But I do think that there is some truth to the notion that we can look at a grape variety's inherent characteristics, and we can think about what makes that grape variety distinctive, and we can even go so far perhaps as to say what aspects of a grape variety's unique characteristics are attractive to us. And if we do that in the case of Blaufränkisch, then I think it is fair to have a certain standard of critique or criticism based on how much the wine is capable of displaying the potential diversity of the grapes. So in the case of Blaufränkisch, to me, one of the things that seems most remarkable is that you have a grape that inherently is able to pull out scents and flavors that require floral descriptors, lots of stuff that requires mineral descriptors, all of these things that require animal descriptors, something we're familiar with, of course, from red Burgundy as well, plus, of course, lots of fruits and berries, not to forget the fruits and berries. But I think it's fair to say that it's a shame if you have Blaufränkisch that doesn't allow for this particular sort of diversity of expression. Then you look at the fact that Blaufränkisch, even if you have a firmer skin, smaller berries, and even if you want to push the extraction a bit more, it's not an inherently tannic grape. It's not going to have an imposing sense of tannic structure. So I think it's fair to say, why not make a virtue out of necessity there? Because it allows for a sort of wine which, although it needs élevage in order to really show that multiplicity that I just referred to, can also be quite approachable as a young wine, certainly never hard and tannic. If you're a Bordeaux fan and you're my age, then you probably think, I mean, why are they doing now what they're doing? I mean, they're running away from what makes Cabernet and Merlot great. Those wines are going to have high tannin, and they're going to have structure inherently, and that's what's going to develop the interesting flavors with time. And if you try to eliminate that with long hang time or tricks in the cellar, it's a shame. And finally, of course, that acidity. What was the big problem back in 1862, and you can read other commentators from the decades thereafter and realize, instead of running from the acidity, look at the uniqueness of a grape that has a very modest tannin and that has this potential for a white wine sense of vivacity and refreshment. I mean, if you look at worldwide at the grape varieties that are really distinctive for low tannin black grapes, that is low tannin, high acidity, first of all, I think of our sort of national grape, Zinfandel, which I love to death, and which I like to say it's like it's a red wine cross-dresser, because the reality is that if it's well done, even when it's 15% alcohol, it's gonna have acid structure almost like a white. Problem though is that 15% alcohol. Look at Barbera again, almost no tannin, high acidity. I love the grape to death, but again, like the Zinfandel, unlike the Blaufränkisch, it has an inherent proclivity to pucker on the vine, and the next thing you know, you have must weights through the roof, and you got 16% alcohol. Of course, in California, you add Jesus units traditionally. I mean, everybody added water to their Zinfandel must, because otherwise it wouldn't even have finished fermenting. But those are unfortunate drawbacks. Blaufränkisch, we don't have that drawback. Of course, you can over-ripen it, but essentially, you have a potential for extraordinarily expressive wines, anywhere from 11.5% of alcohol to 14% of alcohol. That's an amazingly wide spectrum. In the white wine league, I want to think almost that Gruner Veltliner is the only grape that can come along in that regard. So I think it is fair to say, let's look at the unique characteristics of the grape and the virtue if we think they are indeed virtues, and then try to develop our styles with those sort of guidelines of preserving that diversity and expressing the unique virtues of the grape. So thank you for your patience. If anybody wants to...
Thank you, David.
Anybody wants to ask questions?
Now we know how the right style of the Blaufränkisch is. And yeah, a question for David, please. We'll take one because we are a bit...
Yeah.
Actually, it's not a question, but more a comment. Two things. First, quickly about what you were speaking about terroir. It's the exact point. You know, here in Slovenia, the concept of terroir is pretty new, basically. When I came to Slovenia in 2016, it was almost no one speaking about it. And what people are forgetting is there is no terroir without distinctiveness. And that takes time to, as you mentioned, what Dolly is doing in Carnuntum. And that's a very important point that winemakers here in Slovenia has to understand. So I quite like what you were speaking about, the terroir. And the second point, it was something different. I just wanted to thank you, because if this event can happen, it's also thanks to you, because you were the very first early bird jumping the story like a few years ago with Stefan Renard to have this idea of Blaufränkisch movement, and we are exchanging a lot by email, and you helped me a lot to go get in touch with people. So if we are here today, it's also thanks to you. So big thanks for that. Thanks, David.
Thanks a lot.